Very good afternoon to you, and welcome to your Floating Offshore Wind subgroup seminar. My name is Jaya Calder from High, and if this is the first time that you've joined using GoTo, just to advise, there's a couple of ways that we can get your involvement. You'll see a question box. Please feel free to use that throughout the next hour. And you'll also see an icon, it looks like a hand. If you can click on that, if there is an opportunity later on for us to take you off mute, then we're happy to do that. And just to advise that we're recording this afternoon session. So I think we'll just kick off. Over to our panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Paul O'Brien, I'm the cluster manager. Hopefully you all know who I am, given that everybody on the call should be members of the Floating Offshore Wind subgroup, Deep Wind's first subgroup. So this is our inaugural webinar, and we are kicking off with an introduction to our two co-chairs of the subgroup, which is Andronicus Kaffes from Ocean Winds and Julia Rope from Fugro. So without much further ado, we'll pass over to Andronicus to do the introduction.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. My name is Dr. Andronicus Kaffes. I work for Ocean Winds, and together with Julia Rope, we will be co-chairing the subgroup. Before we go into the details of what we would like to cover and what we suggest for the group to achieve, we would like to just spend a bit of time, introduce ourselves and explain who we are, both as individuals and as companies, and effectively welcome you all and kind of invite you to help us co-shape what the work plan for this subgroup can look like in the future. So without further ado, it's likely you've seen recently the announcement of the joint venture between two familiar big players, EDPR and ENGIE. We came together as a joint venture and we formed Ocean Winds, OW, with our flashy yellow colors. And this is the exclusive vehicle, exclusive offshore wind vehicle for both companies. So ENGIE is the French multinational energy and services company, and EDPR is the Iberian Peninsula-based but global leader in renewable energy sector. And effectively, the two coming together effectively led to the creation of Ocean Winds. I think the reason of spending a bit of time talking about our history and kind of the parent companies of Ocean Winds is important to demonstrate the big kind of role Ocean Winds is set to play. So it's, as I mentioned, the sole investment vehicle for both companies, 50-50 ownership between ENGIE and EDPR, and all of the assets, the project pipelines have been combined under this vehicle. And as you can see, quite big growth targets. By 2025, the targets we expect to have between 5 and 7 gigawatts of either under construction or operation of projects, and an additional 5 to 10 gigawatts of projects in advanced development. So hopefully I'm gonna demonstrate with the next couple of slides the kind of size of Ocean Winds, but also the aspirations, the growth aspirations through the growth targets we set for our 2025 targets. So an overview slide here of our total pipeline of projects. And of course, you can see an aggregation in the Northern European countries, including the UK, but also France and Portugal in Europe. But then moving to the west, the US projects on the left-hand side of the slide, and also on the right-hand side of the slides with KF Wind. But out of these projects, which is a combined portfolio in 7 countries, both of bottom fixed and floating, I'd like to emphasize on the floating projects, which is effectively the basis for this subgroup. But before doing so, just to reiterate, today we have about 1.5 of gigawatts, either operational or under construction, and hoping this to move to 5 to 7 gigawatts by 2025. And then we have another 4 gigawatts of advanced development, hoping to grow this between 5 and 10 by 2025. So Here is the floating wind project, similar to the map I showed earlier, but this time just the floating projects with some key items that I'd like to flag them to demonstrate the experience we bring as a developer into this. So we've been active in the floating offshore wind sector when it was at its infancy, at the beginning of the journey in 2008, and we have very close links to Principal Power, the company, the technology developer behind the steel semi-submersible technology. And you can see our portfolio of projects at the bottom of the slide includes WindFloat 1, WindFloat Atlantic, EFGL, Redwood, and KF Wind. And all of them, they are in different stages of development, and they all brought some sort of key lessons learned and experience. So for WindFloat 1, it was our first successful 2 megawatt demonstrator in Portugal, which effectively demonstrated that the technology has been deployed at sea. And then moving on to the next project, in WindFloat Atlantic, 25 megawatts, again in Portugal. And the achievement there was that it was the world's first semi-submersible wind farm, with 3 turbines being fully commissioned now. Then moving on to France with the Energy France Gulf de Lyon EFGL project, which is under development, featuring one of the ones to be commissioned will be featuring the world's most powerful turbines on floating platforms of 10 megawatts. And then 2 of our newest projects in US and Southeast Asia, in Korea, with Redwood Coast and KF Wind. And you can see the size has been increasing. We started with 2 megawatts, 25 and 30 in this pre-commercial or demonstrator phase, but then moving to the pre-commercial and commercial stages in other parts of the world. So we have aspirations for the UK market, as we do with other markets, and we've been active. Most of you'll know us as the Moray East and Moray West development in the Moray Firth in the northeast of Scotland. But we are also active in floating wind, hopefully I've demonstrated. And then last 2 slides where I'm trying to introduce some of the initiatives, local initiatives we've been running towards deep wind. And I'm pretty sure since you've joined this event, you're pretty familiar with the deep wind cluster. And now, as Paul have already demonstrated, we are kicking off this subgroup focusing on floating offshore wind specifically. So I'm reading on the Deep Wind website, 460 members currently registered, company members currently registered. About 200 of those have expressed an interest in the subgroup, the floating offshore wind subgroup. So we have been acting as the cluster champion, previously as EDPR, now as Ocean Winds, for the deep wind cluster, and now co-chairing the floating offshore wind supply chain subgroup. And beside deep wind, another important reference I'd like to bring is OREC Catapult, the Center of Excellence for Floating Offshore Wind, this National Center of Excellence, which is also another innovation center. We are actively engaged, and we would like, as you'll see later today when we are discussing what we're trying to achieve through this floating offshore wind subgroup, we would like to bring forward some sort of have allowed the supply chain to play a role with regards to innovation challenges as well. So this was effectively my introduction to Ocean Winds. Hopefully I've demonstrated that we come from a unique starting point of VDPR and ENGIE together, and we are very well positioned to play a leading role in the global offshore wind market, and more specifically UK and Scotland. We have this vision that we would like to be at the center of the global energy transition, and at our core is trying to combine this right set of skills and this successful track record to effectively become a global offshore leader in the field of offshore and floating in particular. So that was me. I think I'll transfer over to Julia.
Thank you, Andronicus. So we're coming at it from a slightly different perspective to Andronicus and Ocean Winds. We're very much part of the supply chain for offshore wind. And I wanted to give you a quick introduction to Fugo, just so you understand our experience and how we've come to be co-chair of this subgroup. So just a quick summary of Fugro at a glance. Fugro is actually a Dutch company, so founded in the Netherlands back in 1962 as a company providing onshore geotechnical services. Obviously, we've evolved a little bit since then. We're supporting clients both onshore and offshore, and the main areas we work in are renewables, predominantly offshore wind, oil and gas, and on infrastructure projects. We've also grown a little bit since 1962, so we're now approximately 9,500 employees, and we've got offices in 61 countries around the world. And one of those countries is in the UK. We've actually got 8 bases in the UK, and 3 of those are in Scotland, in Aberdeen, Edinburgh, and Glasgow. We've been active in the offshore wind industry pretty much since the beginning, so the early 90s. And since then, we've been involved supporting the development of offshore wind projects in Europe extensively. And we think we've had some involvement in nearly all of the offshore wind projects in some capacity at some stage. And obviously, the industry is growing globally, and our footprint and activities in offshore wind have also grown globally. So we're now very active off the US East Coast and also in Asia Pacific. So for anyone who doesn't know Fugro, we're a geodata company. What is geodata? Well, it's the discipline of extracting information about the Earth and the environment and the structures that are built upon it. And you need this data to be able to design, build, and operate any infrastructure that you want to build in the environment. And when we talk about geodata in the context of an offshore wind farm, we use it right from the very concept phase all the way through the life cycle, through to decommissioning. And with the geodata, we provide people, equipment, expertise, and technology to support the whole life cycle. So we'd like to think we're pretty good at geodata. We're a world leader. And just some examples of what geodata may be. Apparently, mostly things beginning with G, according to this slide. I'm not sure if that was intentional, but it could be a geophysical survey at the development phase for an offshore wind farm or during the operations and maintenance phase. It could be a geotechnical site investigation, or it could be metocean monitoring. So that might be a floating LiDAR for wind resource measurements, or weather forecasting when your site is in construction or operational. And what do we do with that data? Well, we employ what we call a AAA approach. So that's the acquisition of the data, the analysis of that data, and then we provide advice on the data based on our experience and expertise in offshore wind. And at Fugro, we have a saying that together we create a safe and livable world. And we use our knowledge and experience to work with the offshore wind industry to do that. Now, in terms of this subgroup, we want to use our experience in the offshore wind industry and of navigating the supply chain, combine it with our knowledge of the offshore wind sector deal and the industry challenges, and use that knowledge to support the objectives of the subgroup and to support its success. Thank you. That's my introduction.
So effectively, it was important to us, to Julie and I, to give the opportunity to the group to understand, to the subgroup, to understand where the subgroup would live in the wider landscape of kind of different working groups and different government fora, and then what is the kind of unique selling point and what we're trying to achieve. So what I'm going to do in the next slide, I'm going to present this landscape of floating offshore wind related entities in Scotland and try to explain in my own words where I think the subgroup fits. And effectively, then I will hand over back to Julian, at least audio-wise, to talk us through some of the proposed terms of reference we've put together and what we're trying to achieve with regards to the subgroup. And then eventually, and this is your kind of 10-minute warning, there is an exercise coming for all of you. As it happens with this type of webinars, it's quite hard to interact with the audience on a kind of audio basis. However, we're going to use the application, the online application called Mentimeter, where we have prepared a set of questions for you. We will ask your opinion about certain things and how you would like to see the work plan for the subgroup going forward. So as an advance warning, if I can share this page here. So I assume you're connecting either on your laptop/computer or using your phone. So you can either go to www.mentimeter.com menti.com to access the Mentimeter land page, and then you'll be given this 5-digit code, which I'll share again in a moment. And this is how you will interact with us in the exercise in 10 minutes time. Or if you are more like me, prefer to hold your device, you can just go either on Apple Store or Google Play and just type Mentimeter as you see it there, and you can download the app and follow exactly the same steps effectively. Once you've downloaded the app and installed it on your phone, you'll be able to use the 5-digit code and you'll see all the questions. So the good thing about this app is that we will see in real time the information you'll provide. It's completely anonymous, it's aggregated, and we will use this together with Julia to effectively devise a plan of a series of activities with regards to what we are trying to achieve with a subgroup. So back to the presentation and the landscape I've promised. So what you see here at the top are effectively UK/industry interfaces. So most of you will be familiar by now with the UK Offshore Wind sector deal, which gave birth to the Offshore Wind Industry Council, the overarching body effectively trying to implement from the industry perspective some of the commitments coming out of the sector deal. This is at a UK level, but we are lucky enough on the Scottish level to have the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, effectively a bit of a more local equivalent, SOEC. And these two things sit at the top, and they gave birth to Deep Wind Steering Group that you see at the center of your slide. So we are a subgroup within Deep Wind, and Deep Wind, although has a focus on deeper waters, as the name suggests, however, there will be a number of subgroups that will be launched, and this is the first one, the Floating Offshore Wind subgroup, just effectively identifying and recognizing the special role floating offshore wind technologies have to play for Scotland and, overall the UK. So I've explained the overarching agenda, overarching kind of Offshore Wind Industry Council and SOEC at the top, leading into the creation of Deep Wind Cluster, supply chain cluster, and then a subgroup in there. But there are various other little pockets of information that will feed into the subgroup. So you might have heard me speaking earlier about the Floating Offshore Wind Center of Excellence. So this is a great resource. A number of developers have signed up to this and effectively co-finance the development of a number of studies. Quite important information will come out of that, and there will be challenges perhaps identified from this innovation center, but also another equivalent one is the Carbon Trust Floating Wind Joint Industry Project, GIP. And these two innovation centers effectively feed information about innovation challenges and the challenges overall of the sector. And effectively, what we're suggesting is that we feel the supply chain has a role to play into filling those challenges. It doesn't necessarily need to be focusing exclusively on innovation. We just think there is a good role for innovation. And then if you're familiar with the various programs by ORE Catapult, you're probably familiar with Offshore Wind Growth Partnership, OWGP, which is effectively an in-depth advice innovation support function for a number of companies. And what I hope I'm demonstrating with this is that there are a number of similar sort of working groups. The idea is that we will manage to have this focused on supply chain needs from supply chain companies and effectively for the needs of the supply chain companies. And we expect that the kind of make of the companies in the membership of the subgroup will follow a bimodal distribution, where you will have some very experienced in the offshore wind sector and some not so experienced, kind of new starters looking a way in. So with the exercise that will come after Julia will present some of the specific aims within this group, what we're trying to do is brainstorm and get some of the input from the companies that will become the ultimate recipients of the information we will put together. So just before I hand over to Julia, I think from an offshore wind developer's perspective, it's quite important for us to reiterate our kind of intention to have local content where it's practically feasible. And we have a track record of developing and kind of making this a reality in the various geographies we operate. And we see, and we are committed to Deep Wind and their subgroup. That's why we've dedicated resource from a cluster champion perspective, but also from a subgroup co-chair perspective. We are committed to the success of Deep Wind, and we actually find it quite a useful mechanism to provide a voice for the big number of supply chain companies, which in different situations is quite hard to engage in a collective, because we tend to have interfaces when we actually launch certain requests for support, or in fact when some of our tier ones are launching certain opportunities to engage. So we see this as a kind of direct opportunity to engage and facilitate and remove barriers to local companies, barriers to entry to the offshore wind sector. So this is where I stop, and I'll hand over to Julia. I'll maintain control just to make it a bit more efficient, but let me know, Julia, when you want me to change slides.
Okay, perfect, Andronicus, and thank you for running us through this. And I'm really excited about this group that's going to be run essentially by industry representatives on behalf of the floating offshore wind industry. So the next few slides I'm going to run you through are actually a summary of our terms of reference for the group. So Paul, Andronicus and I have sat down probably 2-3 months ago now and looked at these. We looked at the Deep Wind terms of reference and basically distilled them into some terms of reference that we thought would be suitable for floating offshore wind group to get us started. And obviously, so this group has been formed to represent members of Deep Wind with either a sole focus or a significant focus on the floating offshore wind industry, very much to help drive supply chain activity in this very specific area. So we want to assist the floating offshore wind industry in Scotland and maximise the economic benefit that we see here in the domestic market, but also in the international market. And we want to help our members reach their full potential. And the way we want to do this is through aligning with Deep Wind's wider aims. So if anyone has actually ever read the Deep Wind terms of reference, which are on the website, you'll find them there, which basically our ultimate aims are to link the supply chain companies with educational institutions, with the centres of innovation, which Andronicus has just shown, and all with a common purpose to help develop and drive competitiveness and productivity in this market and look at economies of scale to develop commercial offshore wind. So in terms of activities the subgroup is going to engage in, we want to continue and build on the good work that Paul and the Deep Wind team have already been doing. So activities will include promoting floating offshore wind opportunities to the regional supply chain. We want to provide opportunities for the development of new and innovative technology for the floating offshore wind sector via the innovation work streams. So obviously these have been mentioned before. So you've got bodies like the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult's Floating Offshore Wind Centre of Excellence, the Carbon Trust's Floating Offshore Wind JIP, and the Subsea UK Underwater Hub. And we've got a lot of Deep Wind members who are already heavily involved in those. And we want to support the skills and coordination work stream within SOEC to ensure the necessary skills are going to be available to support growth in this sector. So these are the objectives of the subgroup. Essentially, we want to provide support and guidance to our members, and these are all aligned with delivering the aims set out in the UK sector deal. So we want to help members in relation to business development activities. We want to provide advice and guidance to the wider floating offshore wind supply chain in the region. So what are we actually going to do? So we will establish a vision and strategic objectives for the floating offshore wind supply chain. We want to do this with your help. And this will be updated as Deep Wind's role in the supply chain evolves, and also to reflect any offshore wind specific guidance that comes out of OIC or SOEC. Andronicus and I, in our role as co-chairs, will agree on mechanisms to maximise opportunities for floating offshore wind subgroup members and for Scotland. We'll identify and implement goals along with a sensible delivery timetable for the group. We'll take the lead within the Deep Wind cluster to help develop strategic and tactical requirements of the floating offshore wind supply chain in the UK and oversee providing access to the market. And as co-chairs, we will act without prejudice. We want to use the skill sets of the member companies to create links between industry and academia to align on future skills requirements for offshore wind. And last but not least, we want to act as ambassadors for Scotland for floating offshore wind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. So what I would like to do now with all of you would be slowly move to the exercise. So by now you shared the introductions of where we're coming from as companies and individuals, where the whole landscape of the plethora of floating offshore wind relevant bodies and working groups and the likes, how we see a role for the supply chain and how we're trying to materialize this through the subgroup. And what you see in front of you is our aims and objectives. So, however, what we're missing and what we would like to have a bottom-up approach would be the more tangible type of activities and focus areas that we would like, that the membership would like to see going forward. So we have our own ideas. However, we will only share kind of as we go through the exercise rather than necessarily share them in advance, because that will influence what you guys will be voting for. And before we start the exercise, as I've mentioned, please go to menti.com and you'll see the 5-digit code there, 19795. You can either do it on your phone or on your computer screen. And I will launch and I see people have started already, that's great. I will launch the first question in a second, but I was about to say, but I see people have started populating it already, that's great. So what's going to happen is we're gonna have a question similar to what you see just now. And this is our icebreaker. So I'm pretty sure some of you are wondering, what do you mean, who am I and where I'm joining in terms of city, country, or even continent? I don't know. I can see someone connecting from home as well, as a joke. So the whole idea here is that we're trying to just explain how the software works. So hopefully I can see there is a lot of input. 66 people have already submitted the response, but this is just as an example. The following questions will be the real ones, but keep going. I don't know, Paul, how many participants have we got at the moment?
We've got about 90, just under 90 online at the moment.
Okay, I'll wait for the 70 to turn to 80. Let's hope for that. So we know that most of us are engaged on the exercise. So before we kickstart with the first question, following this one, this dummy one, I wanted to explain a few of the ground rules and explain some of the caveats we'll have going forward. One of the caveats is, of course, the new norm, the fact that we have to deal with this kind of activities mostly online, and it's uncertain when we'll be able to have kind of physical event. So as you're responding, I would kindly ask you to kind of consider the fact that some of the suggestions might need to take place in the virtual world. Therefore, it will have to be kind of applicable to this medium. Another important consideration, and we're nearly there, 75 people. Another important consideration, I think, is also the fact that there are live auctions currently going on in the UK. And of course, as it happens, we are all commercial companies, so we will be playing on a fair level without trying to kind of steer competition, let's say, but more collectively as a sector, try and move certain challenges that Scotland faces, move them forward and try and learn from each other in a very ethical way. And also, I think it is important to also explain that this is effectively an add-on on everyone's job. So we are not looking to reinvent the wheel. So please be very targeted with your suggestions. Try be pragmatic. Think that both Julia and I, as co-chairs, we have our day-to-day job and effectively volunteering to help the sector go forward through this subgroup. So we are kindly requesting you to be kind of pragmatic with your suggestions of effectively on a voluntary basis help with the subgroup and the type of activities we can implement. So I think we're nearly there, 79. I think I'm going to call it a day with this first icebreaker. I believe you're all now familiar of how this is going to work. You can see we've got quite a lot of people who have joined from Aberdeen and Scotland overall. I see France, I can see Germany, and then the rest is primarily Scotland and UK, as one would expect. So I'm about to switch to the next question. So hopefully at your end, you'll be able to skip to the next question. So a bit more kind of formatted here. You are given 4 options about your company location and identify the region you are based. Hopefully, if you've had any dealings with the recent developments according to the ScotWind auction, you might have seen that the regions specified there is either Scotland, rest of the UK, Europe, and the rest of the world. That's why those regions are selected here. And effectively, what we are trying to achieve is to understand the composition, which I believe the location of a company within a specified region will also be kind of a proxy to their level of understanding of the Scottish and UK peculiarities. So I was expecting to see, in fact, about 3/4 of people of the companies and the attendees being based in Scotland. And in fact, that's what we see. So you can see from our kind of 68, 70, let's call it 70 participants, the vast majority are based in Scotland, some rest of the UK, but we also have a few international companies with some presence in Scotland as well. So I'll give it maybe another 10 seconds before I switch to the next question, which gets more and more specific as we go through the questions. So I'm now going to the next question, which I think is quite important for us to understand our audience. What you see here is a scale 1 to 10 for 2 questions about your familiarity with the sector. And I have defined the sector as the Scottish offshore wind sector and your familiarity with the supply chain processes with regards to this sector. So we have 2 sliders in there from kind of 1 to 10. On the left-hand side, number 1, I would expect to see new entrants, while on the number 10 on the right-hand side will be the very experienced players, people who have already kind of participated into supply chain opportunities. We would like to acknowledge the fact that there will be a lot of people with a lot of oil and gas experience or another relevant sector, as you define relevant, something that is of relevance to offshore wind. So what we were expecting to see here, which I think is a bit different to what we actually see, was this distribution of responses where some people will be kind of less familiar with certain aspects of the sector, and we have a number of activities suggested of what we could do as a subgroup to assist that and remove some barriers to those new entrants. But also we were expecting there will be quite experienced ones, and as I can see here as well, we have some people even submitting a kind of a response of kind of 10. You can see the numbers there of how people from the audience feel. So we have kind of an average level of like 6, and this is really kind of a quantitative way describing a qualitative measure. How comfortable do you feel with kind of the offshore wind supply chain sector? So I was expecting that the majority of the companies will be companies that have experience in the oil and gas sector, that are looking to transition into the offshore wind sector, and effectively we see some of that. But what I've noticed here is we have a bit of a more uniform distribution. So this might be even a bit of a bigger challenge to please everyone as part of the activities we will be able to do. But you'll see what we recommend in the next slide. So another 10 seconds if you want to quickly submit your response. And I can see some people have had experience with oil and gas, and then quite a mixed bag actually, whether we have new entrants or very experienced companies. But at least we've demonstrated the fact that not everyone is coming from the same starting place and will need different type of activities to address the needs of the membership. So moving on to the next question, here is effectively some ideas addressing the new entrants. So those people that are not extremely comfortable with the offshore wind supply chain and procurement processes. So what we've suggested here, there are 5 ideas coming out of us together with Julia and Paul. However, there is a 6th opportunity, like as other, where we will invite your ideas of what you would like to see as activities. So I'm going to talk through, as people are voting, you'll see whether the people are based in Scotland, rest of the UK, Europe, or rest of the world. There's the respective color, and people are starting to vote towards specific activities. You're allowed to vote more than one activities, as you already noticed. What I would kindly ask you is to vote for those activities that you think will be most useful to you, rather than go for a blanket, all of these ideas will be great to have. So starting from the top left corner, I thought that some companies will probably be experts in what they do in the little component they're fabricating, or the amazing service they're providing, or something of that kind. However, they might not be as familiar with the procurement process in Scotland. What are the main portals? What do I need? What are the requirements to get involved, and who do I need to approach? What are the big companies, and so on? So the first activity was offering an introduction to the offshore wind supply chain procurement process, specifically in Scotland. Next, we had these kind of meet the buyer events organized by people like us, Ocean Winds, like the developers, or the tier ones, like the big players that will effectively eventually subcontract certain parts of the work. So I can see this has attracted quite a lot of interest, and we have had 213 votes with regards to the activities. So the third type of activity was kind of market updates. Perhaps this is not the best forum for market updates wider than Scotland, and we can just have a very dedicated Scottish-specific offshore wind market update, especially for those developers with offshore wind interests and how they see their project pipeline in Scotland going. So that's the offer there, like wider Scottish offshore wind market updates and kind of key triggers in government processes and so on. And then the fourth activity was inviting people like out of the membership, people who are comfortable with the whole process, people who have done this for a number of years, have been successful, would like to share the wisdom for their own reasons and purposes, and kind of demonstrate goodwill towards the supply chain and capability statements toward new entrants. So we could have activities where we invite companies, a representative from a company with a longer track record than the new entrants, and share their experiences. And then lastly, you saw we have certain links to various government fora or other government processes. So an idea would be to invite speakers at the right time for the right topics from government or the various economic development agencies of Scotland to give us some talk, some like explanation of the specific program they're currently running or a report they've launched and so on. There might be opportunities for this type of talks to happen elsewhere. So it's up to you whether you think that's useful for this group or not. I can see people are still voting. I can quickly see that meet the buyer events are the ones that have attracted the most of interest, and then equally introduction to the procurement process as well as like market updates are the top three from what I gather. And I'm going to leave another 10-20 seconds before we move to the rest of the activities. As I've mentioned, the sixth category is other type of activities, and I call them mentoring. Mentoring is perhaps a bit of the wrong term. What we mean is either mentoring from a more established, like a company with the longest track record, a mentoring kind of cognate companies, or effectively it will be some sort of masterclass where various companies around the same area, they've identified something that can be of joint benefit to be addressed collectively rather than individually, where companies are thriving to maintain their competitive advantage, but where collectively the subgroup can do this. So this can be the forum. The next question will be inviting your questions of what would you like to see. Remember, this is capacity building exercises for new entrants. So this is where we invite, other those 5 ideas we had, we invite you with free text and explain the type of ideas and the type of activities you would advise us to do, you would like the subgroup to address. And then the following questions will be addressing some sort of the more experienced companies, part of the subgroup membership. So I know people need a moment to type up their question. They also need a moment to kind of think what they would like to suggest, if there is anything more than what I've suggested already. So I'm going to give you a minute. please, I can see the first response came in. I'm gonna kind of mute myself for the next 20 seconds or so. And as the responses come in, I'll quickly read through and I'll try quickly aggregate them. But then, of course, this information will be available to Julia and I to eventually come up with a work plan that addresses the needs of the sector. So I'm going to mute myself for 20 seconds. Please try suggest areas you are interested in. And remember, this is addressing new entrants, and there will be more coming for the more experienced companies in the next question. And as I said, if you can please make your suggestions very specific, either type of activities or topics you think we collectively, Scotland, we have kind of competitive advantage and we can address collectively.
While we just wait for some of those ideas to come in, I'm sure there'll be someone on the call that has a great idea just after we end this webinar. So I'm going to hand this over to Paul. How can anyone on the webinar today share that idea that they maybe don't think of until after this webinar has finished?
If they actually just email it to me, I can add it to what we're collecting at the minute, and we can collate them all to see how we sort of move forward. So there's no time limit on that, just like there's no time limit in membership to the subgroup, but we do need to look within the next while at which elements of these suggested ideas do we need to take forward. So if you do come up with something after this activity at a later date, just email it to me. You should all have my email contact and just do that. Drop me a line saying what you think, and we will add that into the mix going forward.
Fantastic, thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much. As we're waiting for responses, I don't know, Julia, do you feel covered? Is there anything else you'd like to mention for any of the questions we were asking to the audience so far?
No, I think it's nice to see the distribution of experience. I think I'm like you, I'm quite surprised that we thought it'd be quite bimodal. Maybe people weren't so confident about saying they were very new. It's not a test, so if it is very new, that's exactly why we're here to help. So don't be afraid to say that.
Remember, this is anonymous. It's just collection of the information as an aggregate rather than individuals.
Yeah, I can see the ideas flowing in. So Andronicus, we're going to have to do some homework after we get all these to digest them and to sort of group the common themes and then look at how we address them.
So maybe another 10 seconds or so, please continue typing up that last response, and then I will change to the next slide where, remember, this was the new entrance, and then the next question will be addressing the kind of more experience, and effectively I'm going to call it a masterclass where I'm acknowledging the fact that everyone brings their own expertise in their own domain, and then collectively that joint power is where is going to get us places, I believe. So the next question will be asking, what can we do collectively, those that we feel kind of on the more advanced level, can we focus on kind of topics that Scotland has kind of competitive advantage, or we would like to see Scotland or UK to have a competitive advantage. So I can see we have 60 responses. So I'm gonna skip to the next question for now, and you will be given an opportunity again to feedback by email as Paul suggested. So I've already given the kind of introductory blurb for this masterclass series. So we acknowledge that there will be companies that are extremely specialized and very experienced, and they will have like, so I can see first response coming in. So here is where we think there are a number of challenges the sector in its wider definition, the offshore wind sector in Scotland faces. I can see fabrication, that's one of the known challenges. If we can try drill down further, and remember this is anonymous, so this is the opportunity to slot that thing you wanted to hear about, but you're afraid you're going to give too much away of your company strategy. So if you try focus on what challenges and topics you think are of relevance of a supply chain cluster and a subgroup within a supply chain cluster, the deep wind one, and how can we address that? So here is where I would like to make it a bit of discussion as well with perhaps Julia and Paul. We had similar discussions. We've discussed of potentially companies volunteering to give talks about certain topics. I don't know, Paul, if you would like to come in a sec. So we could, one idea is where we aggregate maybe 2-3 companies. So we kind of invite them to have an educational element on a certain challenge. So everyone is coming together and learning a bit on the topic, but it also provides them with opportunity to showcase their technology or their kind of innovation achievements, but then also have an exercise towards the end where we produce some information, something to move the industry forward, and where we can effectively use this as our mechanism to report back to Deep Wind Steering Committee, which effectively reports back to SOEC, I believe. I wonder, Paul, if you would like to come in and share any thoughts with regards to any challenges or topics, just to kind of cross-pollinate between kind of minds, and people have already submitted quite a few things.
Yeah, thank you, Andronicus. One of the questions that's come up in the past, and that we were keen to sort of get in there, was the need for floating substations or not. Is it dependent on the water depth? So one of the webinars, in fact, the next webinar, we've managed to get one of the tier ones links on, have agreed to do a webinar looking at their floating substation technology and looking at the challenges that's going to be faced around that. So that basically an appeal to the supply chain to come to the party to look at where some of these challenges might lie if we are going to sort of take advantage of a floating substation technology. Will that drive the cost down? These are all the questions that need to be answered when we're looking at this type of technology development, and that will be on the 27th of October. And that sort of sets the theme for looking at areas of innovation, which has come up a number of times in the suggestions from the last question and as topics in this one as well. So that is something that we will be looking for within your suggestions and trying to draw that out as to what types of innovation and areas should we be looking at, and how do we showcase the supply chain's products and services that bring cost reduction to the market, because that's what the developers and the tier ones are interested in, things that are going to lead to cost reduction in floating wind.
Thank you very much, Paul. Julia, any thoughts from you before we try to summarize this question as well?
No, so I'm trying to listen to Paul and read all the good stuff that's coming in at the same time, and failing to sum up any closing thoughts. No, I just like to really thank the audience for so much participation today and all the valuable material that they're going to give us to help develop the objectives of the group, and obviously in how we align with the objectives of the sector deal as well to take the group forward. So it's been an exciting session and a good start.
Yeah,
excellent.
Sorry, I would just like to say that we've got about 4 minutes left. If there's anybody wanting to ask a burning question of any presenters, co-chairs or myself, if you use the chat function, we could maybe take a couple of quick questions and see if we can give you the answer before we come to the end at 3 o'clock. So if anybody wants to use the chat now, please do so to just ask any question that's come into your head during this last hour.
As we wait for people to type their questions, I wanted to very quickly also thank the audience. Hopefully this is the start of a journey. This is hopefully something that is bottom up from industry for industry. And the kind of suggested way forward we had in mind was to maintain a level of filtering and explaining that people that this is not a plain sales pitch opportunity for companies. It's in fact an opportunity for joint effort to tackle some of the challenges and collectively do the best we can for effectively increasing the local content for Scotland. And we are gonna probably aggregate a couple or maybe 3 similar presentations together, so that will form the plenary type of a workshop, of an event, and then have an exercise where we collect in a similar fashion input from you, because as you understand, if we end up having 200 people on a call, it's going to be quite hard to have audio on. So we'll have to utilize technology for that. So as we wait, I wonder whether there has been any questions, Paul.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions that have been coming in, actually just general ones, like will we be making the slides available? So the answer to that is yes. Everyone that's registered will receive a link to the slides, and we've also recorded this session. So we'll be making the recording and the slides available, and we will send it all to you so that you can look at them at your leisure. Questions about when are we going to follow up on the activity that was in this? As I say, we need to do some investigation. There was quite a lot of suggestions, thank God. So we have to get together, myself with Andronicus and Julia, to decide how quickly we're going to come back to you, and we'll come back to you within the week saying when we're going to follow up this activity and what's come out of it.
Agreed. And the general aspiration I may add here is that we will be able to hold maybe events, 2, 3, 4 events a year. So maybe if we see that there is appetite for more, we can do more. It's just back to the comment I made about being pragmatic and effectively addressing real challenges and meaningful updates.
Yeah, it's mostly general questions that have actually been asked that we've answered pretty well so far. Sorry, I was just looking for one that was asking about how do we take this forward. So we've sort of answered that one. And there was also a question, can the subgroup make an effort to be inclusive of consenting and environmental issues in groups in order that it doesn't become top heavy with heavy engineering topics in groups?
I can take kind of personal interest into that myself, coming from a environmental consenting background. Therefore, I believe there will be innovation challenges that the supply chain can play a role, and I think it will be very relevant to have kind of this remit, this focus as well.
Okay, right, so that's us at the end of the webinar. We've just run out of time. I thank you for your participation and very live, active participation in the webinar. I'd like to thank our two co-chairs, Andronicus and Julia, for their part and committing to help look at all your suggestions and work out the way forward to deliver the next stage. So hopefully we'll be back to you in a very short space of time with information on what happens next. But again, thank you very much for participating. And I'd like to thank my colleague, Jaya, for assisting with the webinar as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. All the best.
Thank you, everyone.